What's going on, guys? We're so back. Today we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. How the most powerful military on Earth got stuck in a jungle, a civil war, and the Cold War all at once. If the first Anglo-Afghan War was a lesson in underestimating a country, the Vietnam War is a graduate level course. So the war had a superpower rivalry, the USSR versus the United States, guerrilla warfare, jungle combat, helicopters everywhere, political assassinations, massive bombing campaigns, student protests, television reporters, tunnels full of traps, and some of the most intense battles of the Cold War. And by the end, almost nobody involved felt like they won, except the Vietnamese won, contrary to what any of these American propagandists scholars want to tell you. So the Vietnam War wasn't just a war. It was the Vietnamese Civil War, a Cold War, proxy war, an anti-colonial struggle, and a political crisis inside the United States. Depending on who you ask, it's literally all four simultaneously. So let's get started. So the French show up. To understand Vietnam, we need to go back before America arrived. In the 1800s, France conquered Vietnam and incorporated it into their colony, French Indochina. So France controlled Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Colonial officials extracted resources, promoted French culture, and governed the territory from the top down. So the Vietnamese response over time became, "We would like you to leave," a surprisingly common reaction to colonialism. Enter Ho Chi Minh. So one of the most important figures of the 20th century, Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, revolutionary, and above all, a communist. He spent years traveling abroad and studying various political movements. His primary goal was Vietnamese independence. Communism was part of that vision, but nationalism was equally important. So this distinction would become crucial later on. So World War II changes everything. During World War II, Japan occupied Vietnam. The French colonial government totally collapsed. By the way, there was no fighting in Vietnam. France just handed it over after they lost to the Germans when they capitulated. But so Ho Chi Minh organized a resistance during the Japanese occupation known as the Viet Minh, which is funny enough. So when Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho saw an opportunity. He declared Vietnam independent, and his expectation was the Allies fought for freedom, so surely they'll support our independence. The Allies responded with a collective, well, about that. The First Indochina War. France wanted its colony back. Vietnam wanted independence. These goals proved difficult to reconcile. So from 1946 to 1954, France fought the Viet Minh. The conflict became increasingly brutal. French leaders believed superior weapons and organizations would eventually prevail. This assumption would prove to age poorly. So next, Dien Bien Phu. I'm sorry, I'm butchering all these pronunciations. In 1954, the French established a major base at Dien Bien Phu. French commanders expected to lure the Viet Minh into a conventional battle. Instead, General Vo Nguyen Giap pulled off one of the greatest military feats of the century. The Viet Minh dragged artillery through mountains and jungle terrain that many experts would consider impossible. So French troops suddenly found themselves under devastating bombardments. After a long siege, the French position eventually collapsed, and France's colonial war was effectively over. So the Vietnam gets divided. So the Geneva Accords of 1954 temporarily divided Vietnam. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, the communist government, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States, anti-communists, various national factions, and the division was supposed to be temporary. National elections were expected to be held later on, though these elections in question were not in the room with us. So a temporary solution became a long-term problem. So moving on, we have the United States domino theory. The American policymakers viewed Vietnam through the lens of the Cold War. Rightfully so, they feared if Vietnam becomes communist, other countries will follow. This became known as the domino theory. The logic was straightforward. One country falls, then another, then another, then another. Then suddenly everyone's reading Marx. Whether the theory was accurate remains debated, but it heavily influenced American decision-making. So South Vietnam's problems. So the United States backed Ngo Dinh Diem, president of South Vietnam. The major issue was that many South Vietnamese disliked his government. So these problems that this government had was corruption, political repression, religious tensions, and limited legitimacy. American officials kept looking for stability and said they found a government that often generated more opposition. The Viet Cong. So opponents of the South Vietnamese government organized resistance. These insurgents became known as the Viet Cong. They used ambushes, sabotage, assassinations, and guerrilla warfare. The challenge for American and South Vietnamese forces was simple: finding the enemy. The challenge was also impossible. A farmer by day might be a guerrilla by night. A village might appear peaceful and support insurgents simultaneously. Traditional military thinking struggled with this reality. So this is where we get into the meat and potatoes. So by the early 1960s, America goes all in. American involvement expands rapidly. Military advisors arrive, then more advisors, and eventually somebody noticed that this is starting to look like a war. So now, in 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So reports emerged of attacks involving U.S. naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This effectively gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to escalate military operations. So American involvement was quickly exploded. So soon hundreds of thousands of troops would be deployed. So welcome to the jungle. American soldiers entered an environment unlike anything many had experienced. Vietnam offered dense jungle terrain, mountains, swamps, monsoon rains, and extreme heat. The terrain seemed actively hostile. The soldiers often joked that the jungle itself was trying to kill them. Sometimes it felt true. Sometimes it was true. The helicopter war. So no image defines the Vietnam War more than the helicopter. The helicopters transformed warfare. They could insert troops, evacuate wounded, provide fire support, and resupply isolated units. This here is where the UH-1 Huey becomes iconic. For many veterans, the sound of a helicopter blades became the soundtrack of war. So search and destroy. America's strategy. The idea was to find enemy units, engage them, inflict heavy casualties, and American commanders often measured success through body counts. The logic seems reasonable, but the reality was less clear. Killing enemy fighters mattered less if new recruits kept appearing. This became one of the war's central frustrations. So the tunnels. So the Viet Cong developed an extensive network of tunnels. These systems included hospitals, kitchens, armories, and command centers, and some of them stretched for miles. These things were massive, and American soldiers discovered that fighting an enemy who could literally disappear underground was deeply unpleasant. Tunnel rats, soldiers sent into the tunnels, deserved hazard pay, therapy, and probably some medals for having the biggest fucking balls on the planet of the Earth. Next, we have Operation Rolling Thunder. So the United States launched a major bombing campaign against North Vietnam. American leaders hoped bombing would reduce enemy capacity, break enemy morale, and force them to come to the negotiation table. North Vietnam responded by continuing to fight, and this became a recurring pattern. So now the Tet Offensive, 1968. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched attacks across South Vietnam. Militarily, the offensive was costly for the communist forces. Politically, it was devastating for the United States. Many Americans had been told victory was approaching. Then they watched fighting erupt everywhere on television. The public reaction was, wait, I thought we were winning. Trust began to collapse. So television enters the war. Vietnam became known as the living room war. For the first time, millions watched images of combat on television. Americans saw casualties, burning villages, destruction, and political turmoil. So public support steadily eroded. Wars became harder to sustain when citizens watched them every evening. So one of the darkest moments of the war occurred in 1968 at My Lai. American troops killed hundreds of Vietnamese civilians. This massacre became public later and shocked the world. It intensified debate about the war and raised serious questions about military conduct and code. So now we have President Nixon. He steps up on the scene, and his Vietnamization policy. So he sought a way out. The plan was to reduce U.S. troop levels, strengthen the South Vietnamese forces, shift responsibility back to South Vietnam, and in theory it sounds practical, but in practice it proved more difficult. Building a capable army while simultaneously leaving is harder than it sounds. So the war expands. Ironically, efforts to end the war often expanded it. American operations extended to neighboring countries such as Cambodia and Laos. The goal was to disrupt enemy supply routes. Instead, the conflict spread further across Southeast Asia. So history has a strange sense of humor. So the anti-war movement, protests were growing, students demonstrated, veterans criticized the war, and politicians became divided. American society itself seemed to be fighting internally. The Vietnam War increasingly became a domestic political struggle as much as a military one. So in 1973, we have the Paris Peace Accords. Peace agreements were signed. American combat forces withdrew. Many hoped the war was ending. It wasn't. The fighting between North and South Vietnam continued. And in 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a final offensive. South Vietnamese resistance collapsed, and on April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell. Images of helicopters evacuating people from rooftops became some of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. The war was over, and Vietnam would finally be unified under communist rule. So why America lost? So this is still a very debated topic. Several factors stand out. So the misunderstanding of Vietnamese nationalism. So why many leaders viewed the conflict primarily through anti-communism. Many Vietnamese people viewed it as a struggle for national independence. These perspectives often would collide. Next is guerrilla warfare. So traditional military advantages proved less decisive against insurgent tactics. Technology alone could not solve political problems. So weak South Vietnamese legitimacy was also a big factor. The South Vietnamese government struggled with corruption and political instability, and military could not fully compensate for these shortcomings. Now we have public opinion. So as casualties mounted, confidence declined, American support weakened. Democracies fight wars differently than dictatorships. So public opinion does matter. And strategic goals. So the United States often struggle to define what victory actually looked like, and that's really not a good sign. And the casualties. So the human cost was enormous. Millions of Vietnamese died. Hundreds of thousands of Cambodians and Laotians were affected. More than 58,000 American troops were killed, and millions more carried psychological and physical scars. So the legacy. The Vietnam War reshapes American foreign policy, military doctrine, Cold War politics, and Southeast Asia. It became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a deep reluctance among American leaders and citizens to enter long foreign wars. The central irony. So to conclude this, the United States entered Vietnam largely to stop communism from spreading. Yet after 20 years of intervention, billions of dollars funneled into it, immense human sacrifice, Vietnam was just unified under a communist government anyways. So the war damaged American political trust, transformed media coverage of conflict, and left lasting scars across Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War remains one of history's clearest reminders that military power, however immense, cannot easily solve political problems, defeat nationalism, or impose legitimacy from the outside. Or, to put it more slightly, winning battles and winning wars are not always the same thing, and winning wars and winning peace are even less so.